Really great. The recording is in progress, it's just said to me. So really, thank you so much for coming, and really looking forward to discussing this really important topic with you and to your questions. Just to highlight that this event is being recorded, and your microphones and cameras should be off and will stay off throughout that. But we'd really like your feedback and questions through the chat and raised hand features, sorry, not through the chat and raised hand features, but through the Q&A function during this event, so that you can put questions to the panel. And we'll discuss those after we've had some introductions from each of the panel members. So it's just to repeat, you can't use your microphones or cameras or the chat or raise hand functions, but you can communicate with us through the Q&A. And this is a Cambridge Festival event. It's organised by the Cambridge Global Food Security IRC and the University of Cambridge Decarbonisation Network. And this is a really timely discussion about what we're going to be eating in the future, particularly in the wake of the recent IPCC AR6 Summary for Policymakers report. And that collated together lots of information from previous, much more detailed reports by the IPCC. But it also requires political sign-off from many, many governments, and yet still concludes that we really need to make drastic changes to the way that we're approaching climate change, and urgent changes at a great scale and pace. And we know that food contributes about 1/3 of all climate change, and food alone is on track to cause about 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century, even if we don't have things like heating and transportation, non-food parts of those. And we're going to hear much more about that today, about how different foods contribute very different amounts to climate change. So there's going to be a transformation in our food system one way or another, and that's either because we choose to change the balance of what we eat, or because climate change is increasingly affected what we can produce within a limited amount of land on this planet. And so particularly excited to be part of a discussion on this topic with experts from across the food system, including particularly on the topic of meat. And I'm going to ask each panel member in turn to introduce themselves and speak for 4 or 5 minutes about this topic. And I hope that during that time, it'll inspire lots of questions from you that you'll put into the Q&A function. And then we'll spend most of the time discussing the answers to your questions. We're going to have a little poll at the end as well, and we'll come to that at the very end. So first of all, I'm really delighted to welcome Charlotte Kukowski, who's a postdoctoral research associate at the Cambridge Social Decision Making Lab and the Conservation Science Group in the Department of Zoology at the University of Cambridge. Thank you, Charlotte.
Hi, thanks very much. Great to be a part of this exciting discussion today. So as Sarah just said, without a food transformation, we won't meet the Sustainable Development Goals or the targets that we've set in the Paris Agreement. And scientific analyses have shown that changing diets, and especially cutting down on red meat, can make the biggest difference in allowing us to stay within safe limits of greenhouse gas emissions. But currently in the UK and in other wealthy countries as well, people are eating much more meat than is sustainable. So in the UK, that's approximately an average of 1.5 kilos of meat per week, which is about 5 times the sustainable maximum. So knowing that we're really not where we need to be when it comes to diets, you might be wondering what a sustainable diet does look like then, right? So there's a set of guidelines that I'd just like to highlight briefly that was developed by a group of researchers for how we can feed the world a diet that's healthy and that's appropriate to different cultures by adapting it, but still within limits that are compatible with a safe climate. And this set of guidelines is called the Planetary Health Diet. And this is a diet that emphasizes, in particular, a high intake of fruits and vegetables, of whole grains, like whole grain pasta or rice, and plant-based protein sources like legumes, such as beans and lentils and nuts, and safe limits within that diets can optionally include up to, say, 200-300 grams of meat per person per week, out of which about 100 grams can be red meat. So knowing that we're currently really exceeding those safe limits of meat consumption by quite a lot, how can we get there? I think a first important step is knowing where the impact is. So something that people are sometimes quite surprised to learn about is that the choice of foods we eat matters much more for the climate than where those foods come from or how they package. So red meat in particular makes a huge difference when it comes to the climate. And we can actually have quite a large impact by substantially reducing the amount of meat we eat. So for example, someone who's currently eating a lot of meat, meaning at least 100 grams a day, can almost cut the carbon impact of their diet in half if they cut down meat, especially red meat, to less than 50 grams a day. But just knowing about what to do isn't enough. So researchers working on behavior change used to put a lot of emphasis on education, sort of thinking that if people just knew about the problem, they would change their behaviors accordingly. But this very often isn't the case. So even when people are motivated to eat less meat, for example, habits and just limited brain space for making changes that feel like effort, and also limited choice of affordable and tasty options, and not least of all, lack of time and money can make this quite difficult. So focusing on removing barriers to sustainable diets really is key. So we need to make plant-based options readily available, low cost, appealing, and easy to identify on menus and supermarket shelves, using options like carbon labeling, for example, or just clear vegetarian or vegan labeling. And also think about cultural and social barriers that can have an impact on people's food choices, like what others in your household consume, or what people might think makes for a tasty and healthy diet. And we know from past work that making behavior changes that are helpful for the climate and for health can be much more difficult for people who have less money and access to resources, because climate-friendly options might be more difficult to access or to pay for. So to sum things up, we know it's possible to feed everyone on the planet a diet that's healthy and sustainable, but we're quite far off at this point. And to close that gap between where we need to be with our meat consumption and where we currently are, especially in high-income countries, it's helpful to know about what really matters when it comes to diet. So what we eat, and much less so where that food comes from or how it's packaged, but education isn't enough. So as individual people, we can make changes to our own diets where we can, especially those of us who have the time and the money to do that. But we can also advocate for changes to the places where we shop and eat food to make sustainable and healthy diets possible for everyone. And I think Andrew is going to touch on some of those points a little more later on.
Wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Charlotte. That's a really helpful introduction and lots of things to think about there. And I can see some questions coming in already, which is brilliant. I'm going to introduce our second panelist now. So our next panelist is Daniel Ibsen, and Daniel is a research associate in nutritional epidemiology at the MRC Epidemiology Unit in the University of Cambridge School of Clinical Medicine. Hope we don't have to use that word again today. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Yeah, sorry for that, Sarah. Yes, so my name is Daniel. I'm from the MRC Epidemiology Unit in Cambridge, and I mostly study sort of how our diets impact our health. And as Charlotte mentioned, she mentioned the planetary health diet, and what is really sort of at the center of that, well, that's actually health. That was sort of the foundation from which then the other things like climate and optimizing towards that was sort of built, but health was sort of at the center of that. And I'm sort of going to give you a brief overview of sort of what the future could be like if we should eat less red meat from a sort of through the prism of health. So first, I'd just like to take a step back and just say, well, I think one thing that makes sort of investigating food and health a little bit complicated is that, well, we eat a diet that is full of many different foods, and all of these different foods, they have sort of different ranges of different nutrients. So it makes it more complicated. It's never one or the other thing, and everything is about the context. So that's really, really important. And one thing that's also important is not just saying that you should eat less meat, but what you should eat instead of the meat. And that's actually what my research is very much about, is sort of doing these replacements. So what you eat instead, that's really, really important. So as we, Charlotte also mentioned that actually not just meat, but particularly red meat is a really, really huge contributor to sort of environmental impact and particular greenhouse gas emissions. One thing I think it's important to note is that it's the planetary health diet is not saying remove all meat. It's much more about moderation and lowering your intake, because red meat also contributes with some good nutrients like iron and zinc and B vitamins that we all need, and particularly actually sort of women in the reproductive age and children as well. So again, it depends. That's often what we say in epidemiology, but it depends on if you eat a lot of meat, well, then it will be good for you to reduce that intake. But if you don't eat a lot, actually that will be good. And there are places in the world where you actually should eat a little bit more meat because there are a lot of iron deficiency. So it's just sort of balancing, right? So some places on the globe we will have to reduce, and some places we'll actually have to increase. Yes, and I think the one key point is also it's not so much about a few people making big changes, but many people making some change. Okay, so I actually have 4 different sort of futures of what we could replace meat with. So one thing is probably the easiest one is other animal-based foods. So that could be replacing red meat with poultry, dairy, eggs, or dairy specifically like cheese and yogurt. And I actually studies showing that is still beneficial for your health if you consume a diet with quite a lot of red meat and you eat, you sort of replace that some of these foods with meat. That will lower your risk of coronary heart disease and type 2 diabetes, for instance. And that's easier to implement. The thing is that other animal foods also have some climate impact. So maybe in terms of that, a better option would be more plant-based foods. So like fruits and vegetables and nuts and legumes. So they have a bigger impact also on the health actually. But I think that will be a lot harder for many people to implement in removing the meat from the plate and putting a lot of spinach on it. That will be harder than replacing the meat with a piece of chicken breast, for instance. Then there's these newer foods, these plant-based meat alternatives that are made to sort of mimic meat and sort of really be like a more one-to-one replacement. And you could think, well, that's sort of the best of both worlds, right? You sort of eat what you usually eat, but you get it in a plant-based version. But actually, some recent studies have sort of questioned a little bit the nutritional adequacy of some of these foods. But it's really hard because it's sort of on average, some of them are maybe not a good source of iron and zinc, for instance. But the issue is that it's sort of a moving target. So you really have to be mindful of actually the product that you buy sort of have some of these nutrients added. Then there's this extra wrinkle to this with these plant-based meat alternatives. And that is that it's also very highly processed foods. And we actually don't know a lot about that. But I'll just highlight sort of a recent finding from intervention studies. So studies where people were actually provided with these plant-based meat alternatives compared to a situation where another group got meat, the sort of regular meat version. And actually many of these studies, they actually find a benefit for the blood lipids. So that would be, we could sort of translate that into a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, which is good, and it probably likely due to a higher amount of dietary fiber and less saturated fat sort of compared to the meat version. But there's no, for instance, effect on blood pressure, which could be due to high sodium content of these foods. So they're not sort of perfect, and there's still questions about sort of the long-term health benefits. Then there's the fourth one, which are these cell-based meats, which is sort of a new player, which is sort of not totally in the game, but it's sort of coming up, and maybe that would circumvent many of the sort of at least some of the environmental issues with meat, so we don't have to sort of as well killing animals to get some meat. The one issue there is, of course, we don't know the long-term health impact, but we will imagine that they will be similar to meat as we know it today. But the other thing is, which is sort of coming to my final point here, is that, well, from a health perspective, the way we eat today in general with sort of meat-centric diet and the dietary patterns, for instance, with like fast food and all that sort of, that is still going to be there, that sort of overall unhealthy dietary pattern. And I think for the future, we have to also focus on sort of more the long-term, changing the food culture and replacing sort of the whole everything that goes together with that. So it's not just the burger, but it's also the fries and the soda and everything that sort of goes together with that. So I think for me, the future of meat is sort of, we have these different options and some of the plant-based alternatives, and that is sort of on the short term, we can do something now, but I also have to think, I think we should think more forward as well, and sort of not to forget the long-term shift in food culture, and sort of maybe moving the meat from the center place of the plate onto more like something we can add, like more like a condiment or something like extra we can have with our food. So I think there's a short-term thing we need to focus on now, but we should not forget the long-term shift, and that's for some of the things Charlotte also mentioned with the changes to the diet.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Daniel. That was yeah, raised a lot of interesting issues there, and I can see more questions coming in on that as well, which is brilliant. We'll come back to some of those, but next we're going to follow on from your last topic there with Artun Sukan, who is Head of Strategic Partnerships at Higher Stakes, which is a company that uses state-of-the-art cell culture techniques to create lab-grown meat for human consumption. Artun, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. As Sarah said, I'm Artun Sukan. I am a Head of Strategic Partnerships at Higher Stakes. We are a cultivated meat company, and we're using the cells obtained from the animals without actually harming any of the animal to grow cultivated meat. For those who are not familiar with the process, is with those cells that we obtain from either a blood sample or even a swab from the animal that we take to the lab, we grow them in numbers, and then we differentiate them into the relative components of meat you eat, such as the fat, the muscle, the connective tissue, all the bits. And then we bring those all together to make the final product. Now, why do we do this? As Daniel mentioned earlier, so there are lots of plant-based alternatives out there to be able to reduce your meat intake, especially the red meat intake. But these are not necessarily putting up to the standards, both on nutritionally as well as on the customer satisfaction. People don't necessarily like them because they still want to eat meat. However, we've got a huge challenge with the climate change that we need to tackle, and we need to reduce the emissions caused by the food industry, by the meat industry in general. Now, the cultivated meat concept started many years ago, but the challenge on the meat industry relatively new, about 10 years old now. The impact on the cultivated meat analysis has first been done back in 2012. And the researchers found at the time that if you switch to cultivated meat compared to conventional meat, you can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions about 95% and the impact on the environment. Now, obviously, these have improved drastically over the years, and one of the recent studies, the life cycle assessment of cultivated meat compared to the conventional meat production, was published by University of Delft in 2021. And in that analysis, they've shown that the cultivated meat current state, the state-of-the-art way, already quite sustainably better compared to beef and lamb, so red meat mainly, and still has got a bit of a way to go compared to poultry. However, the main contributor to the climate change, to the sort of greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon footprint of cultivated meat is energy. And the projections done in that study show that if you switch the energy used in the cultivated meat production only 30% to the renewable energy, you already become competitive with poultry production. And if you even increase that, you're already much better on the sustainability side. And there are a few angles that you need to look at this. There is the energy use. Yes, that's the biggest contributor, but there is also the land use. So if you free up the land where the animals are raised, you can bring that back into the nature, reforest those lands, or sort of leave it back to nature. They become carbon sinks. The water use, you can reduce the amount of water used if you're using cultivated meat, because you can recycle the water, you can use it again. and also the ammonia that's been produced by the conventional meat production also causes a lot of pollutions in the environment, contributing a lot of other factors. So all of those things we are trying to tackle at the moment. Are these analysis comparisons are perfect? Or they're not? No, they're changing, they're evolving, and we're aware of this, and we're also trying to do our own assessments as well. We're working with academics at the moment, try to see, okay, can we model this, how it's going to look in the future, and what improvements can we make in the process to make it even more sustainable, even more sort of carbon negative, and essentially, can we capture some carbon from the atmosphere and use it in the process to be able to make it more better? This is a big ambition. Is it going to become reality? Hopefully, that's the aim, but we're working on it at the moment. So I guess I'm sort of at the end of my time here.
Wonderful, thank you, Artun. I've got a few questions on that myself. I should restrain myself and focus on the ones we've got coming in. That's great, keep them coming in. And lastly, but certainly not least, Professor Andrew Balmford is Professor of Conservation Science in the Department of Zoology at the University of Cambridge. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Very pleased to join this discussion this evening. I'm a conservation scientist, as Sarah said, so I care about creatures, but particularly non-domesticated animals and plants and their conservation. And I'm going to try and make 3 points, if I can, just to start with. One is that we've been talking largely about climate change. I'm going to talk a bit about the impact of food production, particularly meat production, on biodiversity. Then I'm going to talk about ways in which we might lessen that and really round out some of the points that people have already made about things we might do on the demand side, our diet really, but also before that, on the supply side, about how we produce the meat that we are going to consume one way or another. So to start off, as I say, we've been hearing a lot about the climate, but I want to make it clear as well that food production in general, livestock farming, and especially ruminant farming in particular, have a greater set of negative impacts on global biodiversity, all the other creatures on the planet, than anything else that people do. Farming already takes up half of ice-free land on the planet. That means it's the cause of the great bulk of habitat clearance, and habitat loss is the main problem that most species face. But different foods vary enormously in their environmental impacts. We've been hearing in the UK, for instance, it takes around 100 times more land area to produce a kilogram of beef than to grow a kilogram of beans. Worldwide, we get about 30% of our protein from livestock, but their production takes up something like 3/4 of all farmed land. So I think it's fair to say that human carnivory is probably the leading cause of the extinction crisis today. And that explains why many conservationists like me are so concerned about farming in general and meat production in particular. So what are the sorts of things we can do to lessen the environmental costs, not just to biodiversity, but more broadly of our fondness for meat? Well, on the supply side, which we haven't talked about very much this evening, in terms of producing livestock, there are many things that can be done to lessen the impact of production. But the point I want to make is that then these are not perhaps commonly what we might think. So the greatest impacts of producing animals are primarily through land use effects, and then through greenhouse gas emissions. And when we've evaluated those in our research systematically for different ways of producing livestock in a particular place, we found that consistently both of those impacts are lowest per unit of production, so per kilogram of meat, in more intensive systems. So that's livestock production systems that in the global south might involve improved breeds or improved pastures or better veterinary care. And in the global north, things like more indoor housing, greater use of feed rather than pasture, and so on. And at the other extreme, in almost all cases, extensive production systems like grass-fed systems or organic systems, things like something called mob grazing, which is popular for a while. they're substantially worse in terms of biodiversity impacts per unit of production and in terms of impacts on the global climate. And that's because animals in these systems are growing more slowly, and they consequently produce more CO2 and more methane in reaching slaughter weight. And critically, they take up far more land area that could otherwise be used to retain or restore biodiversity and carbon-rich natural habitats. Now, there are some other things we might want to get onto in questions about higher yielding livestock systems, maybe welfare, use of antimicrobials. Happy to talk about that. But in terms of impacts on other species and indeed the climate, the evidence strongly suggests that these are lowest in more intensive livestock production systems. That's what I want to say about the supply side, but we've also been hearing a lot about things that we could do to reduce demand for meat as well. As Daniel said, that's not a good idea everywhere. In some parts of the world, people would benefit health-wise from eating more meat. But in all analyses I've seen, unless in the richer parts of the world like ours, very many people change their diets away from eating so much high-impact food, particularly ruminant meat, it seems that avoiding climate catastrophe and limiting the extinction crisis will be almost impossible. The numbers just don't add up. Now, there are lots of ways of trying to address that demand in terms of actually what we eat. As people have been saying, we could continue to eat meat, but cut down our portion sizes. We could switch to less harmful meats, so away from red meats towards pig and poultry. We could switch to lab-grown meat, as Artun's just been explaining. We could eat plant or microbe-based alternatives. So there are lots of alternative dietary shifts. In terms of encouraging people to shift their diets, again, there are different things we could be doing. We could be thinking about changing the relative prices of meat, especially ruminant meat versus the alternatives. One way of doing that would be via carbon tax on food, which preferentially shifted increased costs of more impactful foods and maybe was used to subsidize the costs of less impactful foods. But of course, taxation at any time, particularly taxation on food, is something that's very unpopular politically. Another approach there might be through attempting to equalize the markups that are charged on different foodstuffs in restaurants or supermarkets. Most times you go out for a meal at a restaurant, the vegetarian meal may not cost a lot less than the plant-based meal for you as the consumer, but it probably costs a lot less to produce. We might, those are pricing things, we might try to change the relative availability of meat and plant-based meals. Here in the university, at one extreme, we removed the highest impact meats, so ruminant meat, altogether from the offer available from university outlets. We might do things like switching the order in which different meals are offered within buffets and on menus. And we've done quite a lot of experimental work investigating that, and it can work, but the effects are rather patchy. Actually, it's not a panacea. The thing that we found had the strongest effects. This is a student of mine called Emma Garnett, who was able to run enormous experiments in colleges here. And she found that simply doubling the relative availability of plant-based meals from 1 in 4 of the offerings to 2 in 4, with meat still available in every option, that increased the uptake of plant-based meals by between 40 and 80%. So that was a very striking effect. Charlotte talked to us a bit about the limits of education in this area. The one thing that I'm struck by there is, I guess it's not around education so much as messaging and prospects for what might be done in terms of advertising. And I'm really struck here by the results of a 2019 ban implemented in London by Transport for London. They banned advertising high-fat, salt and sugar foods on Transport for London billboards, basically. So a relatively straightforward intervention. That led to a 7% reduction in household calorie purchases right the way across London. So a staggeringly strong effect. And I'm going to be watching with interest what happens next year in the Dutch city of Haarlem, which inspired by the Transport for London results, will be introducing a similar restriction across the city on advertising meat. But none of these supply or demand side ideas are silver bullets. We're probably going to need action on several of these different fronts. And then, but just to close, I think it's worth also remembering something that several other speakers have said, which is that we don't need to be talking about a complete cessation of carnivory here. We need to reduce the amount of meat we need. We don't need to cut it out altogether, but we do need substantial change. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Andrew. That's brilliant. Well, thank you also for all your questions, which see if we can get to quite a few of these. So I'm just going to put one question per speaker and then move on to the next question, I think. So first of all, I've got a question for Daniel that's come in here, which is some of the plant-based dishes in supermarkets are highly processed, but people think they're better for them than eating meat. Do we need more honesty about meat replacement preparations?
Yes, so that's a good question, and of course, sort of better for them in, I guess it's sort in terms of health. And the issue, I guess the problem is here that, well, you don't know what people are replacing that with. So as I mentioned, there was actually some results that came out like this week, almost like a meta-analysis that actually compared studies where you have given people in their diet a lot of these plant-based meat alternative for I would say a short period of time, like 6, 10, 12 weeks maybe. And then they compared that to a group that got like just the regular meat, right? And you actually saw an effect on the blood lipid, so like LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol, which would actually say that at least here in the short term, maybe they're better alternative for health in terms of that marker, right? Then there's this other question: what about the nutrient status? And we don't know about that. So that's really, I would just say that sort of what we know may be good for some things, but for the nutrients, which would take a longer time in a population that is sufficient. And maybe it depends on the population as well, because if you imagine that you say, well, you actually already eat a lot of meat, and then you replace 2 or 3 servings per day, maybe that won't change you get sufficient iron, then maybe it's not an issue. But if you're close to the limit and you remove that meat, then maybe it's an issue. So it's sort of it's complicated, but I think for the most part of the Western world, we get sufficient amount, most of us. So I think that will actually be a better switch. Then the long-term health effects as well, like not just the nutrient status, but sort of like development of different diseases. We still don't know about that, but from the short-term data, it doesn't look as bad as you would think.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Daniel. Yeah, so it depends what else you're eating, I suppose. Yeah, about that as well. Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to follow up on a point that somebody's asked about, a point Daniel made earlier. I'm going to put this question to Andrew, though. So this Daniel mentioned about long-term dietary pattern, that it might be beneficial and necessary to transition culturally to eating more pulses, because growing these can help promote soil health and reduce requirements for high carbon impact fertilizers. So beans rather than beef is what the questioner has said. Andrew, do you want to comment on that?
Well, simply, that sounds like a very good idea to me. Clearly better environmentally in terms of the greenhouse gas and land use costs per gram of protein. Be interested if Daniel had any comments on the nutritional sufficiency of a largely pulse-based rather than meat-based diet. But certainly in terms of the environment, in terms of soil health too, could be a very important, well, it is in many parts of the world, of course, an important part of crop rotations, so helping with reducing the costs of producing our grains as well. So very important. The other thing, and of course, there's an extraordinary variety of things that you can eat, which you can't, but I think with the interesting things there, particularly in countries like our own, maybe less so in some other parts of the world, is people's knowledge of how to cook things with rather different ingredients, and so I think with all of this, as I think Charlotte said, there's an important serious. We need to think carefully about the barriers to adoption, the barriers to change. And I think in the case of switching to lots of different pulses, for example, some of those, they're not so much around the costs, but around the cultural and just knowledge of a bit how you cook appealing looking meals using those rather different ingredients.
That's a great point. Yeah, I like the way that the word culture was used in a question, and I think that you've hit on the major barrier there about the culture as well. Daniel, do you want to comment on the nutrition of this beans rather than beef question?
Yeah, so again, I think for the most, like most of us that are participating in that, well, eating more beans and a lot more beans, that will be beneficial for health. But it's one thing that we are investigating in the research group that I'm part of, sort of actually legumes and instead of other things, because much of the data we have for of the consumption, for instance, in the UK, there's not that many people that eat a lot of legumes, so the data it's not so much there on the longer term, but what we have, it looks like it's still better. Of course, if you only eat beans, well, then I think with almost any food, right, then you will not be sufficient, because you need that variety, which is really important, sort of a pillar of like nutrition in general. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to a question now for Artun. So it says here, there's a journalist who is quite skeptical about cultured meat because of hygiene issues, and meat cultured in bioreactors would breed also bacteria. How is the industry addressing this as you scale up?
Well, to be honest, with the bioreactors, if there is any contamination and if there is any bacterial contamination there, the cells die. So you won't really get the meat. You need to have absolute sterility and absolute sort of good conditions for them to be able to grow in numbers and then sort of get to the levels then we want to achieve. So that bacterial contamination worries are not necessarily in line with the current industry practices. In fact, we're trying to make sure that we could we sort of get to a level where we have so many good practices that we don't even need to use antibiotics in our system anymore, which in the current livestock, many people would know that there's high use of antibiotics that goes into the water system that damages the environment as well. So we even reduce those things. So I think overall, from the sterility, from the hygiene perspective, probably it's a lot better than any other stuff that you will get out there.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's all relative, isn't it? Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to pass a question to Charlotte now. So this is, do the panel have suggestions for behavioural change? We advertise plant-based meals first. We train chefs to learn plant-based modern meals, and hence I work in a collegiate university.
Thanks. Yeah, great to hear that people are interested in helping to bring about these changes. And I think it's particularly good to highlight that organizations like a college can have really big impacts actually on people's behavior, because what they offer in terms of options really affects the choices available to a lot of people, right? So great that you're taking these steps. And yes, I think as Andrew's outlined in his contribution, sort of making sure that vegetarian and vegan options are available, that they're prominently displayed and visible, easy to identify, affordable, is a really promising way to go about it. Perhaps also offering education just specifically on the impacts of different foods so that people know which choices really matter and why they matter, and trying to get people on board with that. And then perhaps if people sort of get to have this experience of actually eating plant-based foods can be really tasty and enjoyable and offer new and exciting flavors, could have spillover effects to other settings. I think we're still sort of looking to collect data on that, but that could be one way in which acting as an organization could have effects outside of that setting alone as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Charlotte. Great, we've got a question about pasture-fed meat. I'm going to pass this to Andrew. So Charlotte mentioned reducing red meat consumption to help with climate change. I have pasture-fed organic beef from our local farm. Is that okay?
That's a good question. If you'd asked me that before we looked at this in depth 5 or 10 years ago, I'd have said, yep, that sounds like a good idea. And we've spent quite a long time since then looking at all the studies we can of different ways of producing beef and other products. Unfortunately, the environmental footprints of pasture-fed beef are substantially worse than those of animals that are fed feed, and organic production makes it worse still. So I'm really sorry to say that in terms of the environmental impacts on greenhouse gases, on land use, which is the critical one for biodiversity, even in terms of soil loss, the evidence seems to be that actually no, that's the popular perceptions around pasture fed beef and around organic production simply don't stack up against the data. So I now actively avoid all organic food if I possibly can. I'm doing that from an environmental point of view.
Wow, thank you. I guess following on from that, a question for Daniel. Can we get the same nutritional benefits from high intensive livestock systems as from organic pasture-fed meat?
Short answer is yes. I have not seen like any data that one should be nutritionally better than the other. Actually, yeah. So I've seen some read a lot of speculation about it, but never really seen any good data to show that one is better than the other. Not at all. I would also just like to follow up a little bit of one thing Charlotte said that I found was very, very interesting with sort of providing more options, and Andrew, you also mentioned it. And I think one thing that I think it also helps with, and you talk about sort of these ripple effects, it is also that by showing how a diet could be and sort of having that as sort of the standard option, this is sort of sending a signal of this is what we usually eat. This is what the first thing you see, okay, that's the dish of the day, for instance. If that's sort of a plant-based meal, that is also sort of trying to push this culture that we talk about as this is sort of the usual. And then the meat part is something else. So I'm just saying, I think I've seen some arguments as well, and maybe Charlotte, you can sort of follow up on that as well. But if you really want to change this culture, you also have to, I guess, as I see it from the bigger sort of structural changes, have to set up the system so it sort of goes in that direction that we wanted to help it on its way, because it's not just going to happen by itself. I think that's what we are realizing here.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. And there's lots of questions coming in now, which is great. Just noticed there's a comment from Matthew Hayek, a world leader in this area. So thank you for joining us, Matthew. Commenting that we may also be on the cusp of avian flu spillover to mammals, including humans. So that's another factor to consider in all of this. Thank you, Matthew. Just to get back to the questions. We've got a question here about lab meat. You mentioned, Artun, about reducing land use if you use cultivated meat. But what are the feedstocks for that lab meat, and doesn't that use land too? And is there a sort of relative feed conversion ratio or something compared to poultry?
Yeah, sure. And just a sort of one quick point on that, the word lab meat is no longer used. So the industry overall consensusly decided that the terminology that we use is cultivated meat or cultured meat, because not necessarily the meat is produced in the lab. So what we're trying to do is produce meat in big reactors, very similar to beer production, yogurt production, cheese production that's currently been done in large steel tanks. In the industry, it's exactly the same way that we're trying to do for meat. So that's the killing point on the land use as well. So per square meter of land that you set up your facility, you could potentially obtain a lot more kilograms of meat using cultivated meat because they're produced in efficient bioreactors. When we come to the ingredients of it, is that it uses sugars, amino acids, salts, and water, essentially. Some of them could come from plant sources, yes, but some of them could also come from agricultural waste materials. Say, for example, sugars. If you take the cellulosic sugars and refine those that you obtain from the forestry byproducts, that while you're looking after a forest, that can be fed into the cultivated meat production. Therefore, you don't have to have sugar crops growing and converting land. So the main idea is, as you grow more meat, by the population increases, we currently need to deforest more land and make more land for the animals. Where if you switch to the cultivated meat, you can prevent that deforestation and opening up more agricultural land. Eventually, you would be able to rewild those lands. The current agricultural lands will allow you to sort of get the environment back to its normal shape. Going back to your question on the conversion ratio, there was a research published back in 2017, collaboration between University of Edinburgh, University of York, and Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, KIT, and they reported in their research that at the time, the feed ratio is quite comparable to chicken, which is around 4, so poultry in general. I haven't seen a more recent research. We are currently trying to do that modeling as well. That's on our roadmap to see what would be the feed ratio, what will be the impacts of the supply chain that we're going to use in the future when we scale this up onto the environment. That's on the roadmap for us for the next 2 years, essentially. We're working with academics who will announce this later on once that's finalized.
Fascinating. Yeah, really interesting what different sorts of feedstocks you could use that we're not currently able to use. Thank you. We've got so many questions on insects. I think I'm going to have to address the insect in the room or whatever. So we've got multiple questions. I'll just read one of them. Is there a pathway for insect-based food products? Does it offer a scalable alternative in terms of sustainability and nutrition? I'm going to take that to Charlotte first and put your hand up, wave if you want to also comment on that. So Charlotte.
I'm not sure about the nutrition of insects, so perhaps I'll pass that on to someone else.
Sorry to spring that on you. Yeah. Does anybody want to put their hand up, or shall I make a few comments? Andrew.
I could say just a little bit about it. I think it's interesting. I had I don't know a great deal about it. I supervised a student working on it a few years ago for a PhD. And her view, which was much more informed than mine, is that it's interesting, but that to date in the north, it's different in the global south, where lots of cultures depend very much on insects at certain times of year. But in the north, it tends to not substitute out for meat. It tends to be an added extra. So it's not a way of reducing the footprint of our meat consumption, or at least operationally, that's not how it's manifesting itself. At the moment, we end up having, exciting protein snacks made out of crickets, but it doesn't mean that we're eating less meat. I may be out of date there.
Thank you, Andrew. I can see Daniel waving there. Daniel.
Yeah, no, I just want to follow up on that, because I remember we did a similar event, part of the Cambridge Festival last year, and then there was this person who he had an insect company, and it was very interesting that, well, first from a nutritional point of view, yes, it actually can be good, but again, as he said, well, but the issue is that no one really wants to eat it here in sort of the global north, and they were using it mostly as giving animal feed. That was what they were using it for. So I think there is potential, but if we find it hard to get people to eat plant-based meat alternatives, which very similar, then I think insects, that is gonna even be a tougher insect to swallow.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. And I'm just going to summarize a couple of other comments that have come in, and then we're going to move on to a poll. So just to mention other comments, there's several comments on this. in terms of, we've not really talked about animal welfare. There's one about a friendly reminder that pigs are as smart as a 3-year-old child, smarter than a domestic animal. So we haven't talked about animal welfare on this discussion. So just to, there's got comments on that in the chat. And then also we've got a comment from Matthew Hayek about infectious disease, and what about how do we really factor that into the equation about sustainability as well. I suggest that we move on to the poll now. We've got a couple of poll questions for you. Then I'm going to ask each member of the panel to just give a very final sort of summary comment, and then we can reveal the results of the poll. So shall we move to the poll now? So yes, we've got a poll here, and the first question is, do you feel this discussion might lead you to consume less meat, yes or no? And do you feel confident of talking to a friend about this issue? So yes or no. So we look forward to your answers on that poll. So you should be able to just click on the buttons there. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to go to each member of the panel in turn and just ask for your sort of wrap-up comments. So I'm going to go to Andrew first. Andrew.
Thanks. This isn't so much a comment as a sort of wish, if I could change one thing that might be possible. And it follows on from something one of the questioners pointed out about training chefs, in a question about shifting, what can be done. And it's just an observation really, and then a sort of hope. We take a lot of our cues, I think, in this country about what food is desirable from chefs. Chefs are really influential, whether that's when we go out to a meal and think, oh, that's nice, or that's something I could aspire to cook, whether it's on the telly, whether it's in books. And yet most chefs are trained to think of a good meal as having meat at the center of it. So I think shifting the way in which chefs are trained, and I don't mean a small shift, I mean a major shift in the way in which chefs are trained, so that we come to see meat not as something which is essential for almost every meal, but really as was said earlier, as a luxury, and vegetarian food not as some poor substitute that you bung in to replace meat in a meal, but as something that's exciting and tasty and easy to cook. That barrier thing again. I think if we could do that, that could have disproportionate effects for many of the things we've been talking about.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Artun.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I guess one thing that I would like everyone to take away from this is that cultivated meat is me, and I would say give it a try, because it's the exactly same meat as you would eat. However, it is a lot better for the environment and a lot better for potentially for ourselves as well.
Thank you, Artun. Daniel.
Yes, I guess I'll also just end up on a sort of a little bit of a call to action, just sort of reiterating sort of the point that one of the things I think is really, really important is just this realization that it's really not about everyone going vegan, but it's about everyone changing at least just a little. And I think that's one thing, just sort of changing one meat dish, trying to do that today, maybe not today, now dinner is maybe already ready, but then tomorrow, sort of that everyone sort of try that. I think that would be sort of the first start. So that's sort of my key sort of takeaway or call to action, I would rather call it.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. And Charlotte.
Yeah, I'll just take a bit of a step back and sort of say that it can be really easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the climate crisis and other related environmental problems. But I think there's also power in realizing where we can have an impact, right? And changing the way that we eat is actually one of the bigger ways in which we can have that impact on the climate. And like other people here have said, perfection isn't necessarily necessarily the way to go, but impactful changes really are. And we can achieve this by just cutting down or on just reducing quite a bit how much red meat we eat. and we can advocate for policy changes that prioritize diets that keep us within that safe space of greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental indicators. And we can also use our influence as members of organizations like schools, universities, our workplace, and our social circles to get those positive changes implemented.
That's a really great point, Charlotte. Thank you very much indeed. And I think we're just going to go to the results of the poll. Although just to caveat to question 1, we had a few comments in the Q&A there that I've got one here. Question 1 on the poll: as a long-term vegetarian, my answer no may be misleading. I will continue to eat minimal meat as this session has only strengthened my resolve. So just bear that in mind, that I guess we could also be preaching, as it were, not preaching a particular solution, but we may be talking to a number of people who already eat relatively little meat in this audience. So we can see about 2/3 of people said that they are actually thinking of consuming less meat as a result of this discussion, though. And we've also got question 2: do you feel confident about talking to a friend about the issue? Yes, 93% of people have said yes. So that's really interesting, and I think it's just such an important point that Charlotte raised, and that didn't really come up in the conversation, was the fact that in the questions was this question about individual change versus systemic change, which I think you alluded to there, and Andrew gave a number of examples of types of systemic change that we might have, including this brilliant study that Andrew did with Emma Garnett on changing the placing of things in a canteen, and how and the number of options in a canteen. So I think that it's really crucial, as Charlotte said, that we talk to other people about this. And in fact, we've got a comment in the Q&A actually really highlighting that point. More of these discussions need to happen. And also a comment from Matthew Hayek. I'm presenting at the Cambridge Department of Geography on April the 27th. Hope to see the panel and participants in attendance who can make it and continue the conversation there. So really crucial that we do talk to other people about this, because if we're going to get this kind of systemic change, we need people to want this change. And if we look at what happened with plastics over the last 5 years, for example, for better or worse, there's this public outcry really about changing the plastic policy, which is really, supermarkets, food producers, governments are really falling over themselves to tout their changes in policy around plastic. But could we get to a point where we have really public driving policy changes that Charlotte mentioned there around the climate impact and health impact of food? It feels like a long way off at the moment. Something like a sugary drinks tax, we can't have that unless we've got public awareness of the impact of sugary drinks on health. And so can we also get that same kind of awareness out there to drive whatever policy change is acceptable to people in terms of climate change, and really make a difference. So I hope that gives you lots to think about, and also to discuss with your friends, and to share really more generally to try and get this kind of change to support a really effective transformation in the food system. Just like to finally wrap up, thank you hugely for all your questions, and massive thanks to the panel for really getting through a huge number of them there, and some really stimulating discussion and thoughts to go away and think about. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.